I said, "Sure, take it, but since he's on the forward slope, he's been there all day. Someone will relieve him soon." As if on cue, a man came over the hill to exchange positions with his buddy. The man on the forward slope evidently heard his signal. Deeming it dark enough to be safe, he stood up. Maxwell dropped him. His relief panicked, running back up the hill, stopping behind a tree on the skyline. Portions of his shoulders showed on each side of the tree. Maxwell was puzzled. "He's hiding behind the tree. What should I do?" I laughed. "Shoot through the tree. That bullet will go through at least 2 feet of solid oak." After he shot, the enemy soldier slowly crumpled in a heap at the base of the tree. The following day was spent planning covering fire for the next noon's attack. That afternoon, 2 more men came up the hill to our position. Each had a dog. One animal was a German shepherd, the other a nondescript mongrel. I was informed they were messenger dogs, not trained to attack. Shortly before our jump-off, I sent Lieutenant Charles Ross with his platoon down the left side of our peak to cross below and cut off the retreat of the Japanese when we pushed them off the hill. He was accompanied by one of the dog handlers with his dog. I had removed the plug from my M1 and equipped it with a conversion plug to fire smoke grenades, figuring smoke would cover our advance until we were within hand-to-hand distance. I also called for the 4.2 mortars for smoke in the drawer to our left to conceal our advancing men. They failed to tell me they had only white phosphorus shells, no HC smoke, which is harmless. I was not to know this until after the attack was over. 2 of my men received burns from the phosphorus. Fortunately, they were not life-threatening. At the last moment, I heard loud shouting in the rear. Anxious to jump off, I turned back to check it out. An enlisted man said loudly, "I'm not going on the attack unless an officer goes first." I was so disgusted that I grabbed the man by his sleeve. "You and I are going to be the first men up on that hill. You're coming along with me." Everything went as planned. The machine guns chewed up everything until we reached the top of the opposing hill. I fired several smoke grenades as I went up the forward slope, disappointed at the little smoke they emitted. We had competition getting to the top of the hill. It seemed everyone wanted to be the first. On the summit lay a Nambu machine gun, which I grabbed, as my M1 rifle had to be hand-operated for each shot. There were at least 8 to 10 full magazines lying nearby. Slipping on a clip, I took several more, then ran forward about 150 feet over the ridge in order to shoot down at the adjoining saddle and lower ridge. Lieutenant Paul Clemens and 7 of his men followed me. To my sorrow, I found the Nambu wouldn't fire. It had a ruptured cartridge in the chamber. Evidently, its Japanese owner had not taken proper care of it. The chamber was rusted. At that moment, dust kicked up all around us. Somewhere from our front, a Nambu began peppering. As we hit the deck, Sergeant Victor Anderson was lucky enough to find a large hardwood stump for cover. The rest of us dropped into the best places we could find. I landed tightly locked against a newly dead Japanese soldier, my face within 5 inches of his open mouth. Flies were already starting to buzz in and out. A second machine gun, this time a heavy .31 caliber, opened up. We were so pinned down that we couldn't move. When the .25 Nambu stopped for another magazine, Anderson leaned around his stump and rolled off 8 rounds from his M1. Lieutenant Clemens faced downhill, his head a foot behind and above my buttocks. A tight Nambu burst punched in the dirt between his head and my rear, missing us both by inches. Thank goodness Nambus fired a tight pattern. Clemens spoke up grimly. "Chuck, better keep your ass down or you'll get it shot off." Where does a man get a sense of humour in a situation like this? We were pinned for nearly 10 minutes while they fired literally hundreds of rounds at us. Something had to give, and that was me. I yelled to Anderson, who was firing intermittently as the Japanese machine gunner changed magazines. "I've got to make a break and get us mortar fire. Can you cover me? Best you get up behind me when he finishes the next magazine." I took off while Anderson fired rapidly, crouching tightly behind him. Tapping him on the shoulder, I said, "Okay, I'll make the break when he quits firing next time." The Japanese was a little quicker at loading, as bullets were kicking up in front of me as I raced up the hill. Clearing the top, there sat a complacent group, my executive officer, Mork, Dick Hamer, and my radio operator. I was damn mad. I looked at Mork. Why in hell didn't you call for mortar fire ahead of us? You knew that was the thing to do. All eyes turned to Corman, my radio operator. He looked guilty as hell. I lost the base section of the radio antenna during the attack. The radio won't work. Like hell it won't. Where is the rest of the aerial? Shamefaced, he produced it. Give me your handkerchiefs. Wrapping the antenna with the handkerchiefs for insulation, I picked up the handset and held the aerial to the post. It worked to perfection. Thank the Lord I had been trained as a radio operator back in 1937 and knew a little. Within moments, 4.2 mortar fire was slamming the Japanese in the saddle. The balance of my crew walked back over the hill in safety, with only one man wounded. We had no fatalities, we had been lucky. Yet one man had the stock of his Browning automatic rifle, bar, shot off. I had the second dog handler send a message to Ross, telling him to return. This dog was gone only a few minutes, then it came back, still carrying the message. Moments later, the German shepherd from the patrol showed up. The dog carried a message that read, "Saw your dog, but he was timid, wouldn't come to us. What do you want? Send our dog back with the message." This was done. Then someone suddenly said, "Hey, Cap, you've got a bullet hole in the front of your pants, right by your balls." Sure enough, one slug had gone through while I was running up the hill. Everything must have been swinging just right. Someone found the body of the 145th Infantry Sergeant. It was sent down the mountain. Our sojourn lasted only another day. We were pulled back before we could progress farther. The walk back down the Laruma was just as tiring as the walk upstream. We found the wreck of a Cub J3 in the riverbed. It hadn't been there before. The pilot had walked away. He'd probably had an engine failure. I learned a lesson the hard way. Don't get caught on the forward slope of a hill. It can be deadly. Lieutenant Milton Shedd's patrol had worked around the right flank of the enemy. Due to the rough terrain, he had trouble with men who played out, having to leave 5 of the weakest on a ridge, a future rendezvous point. His native guide took Milt and his 6 remaining men close to a small village where they could hear Japanese chopping wood while shouting back and forth. His men had made a dry run of a similar situation previously, so positions were assigned and the men made their approach. One shack held 3 sleeping men, 6 were eating in front of the shack, and 2 more were chopping wood. Other Japanese moving about brought the estimate to 25 total. Throwing a grenade, Milt followed it with 6 more. The enemy was bunched up, screaming amid the firing of Shedd's guns. A heavy Japanese machine gun opened up, but was silenced by grenades. Shedd's guide was the only man wounded, and from an American grenade. Milt moved out before losing men. By his estimate, they killed or wounded at least 20 enemy. Here is Milt's version. I had a severe time restriction on my mission and was about an hour short of my objective when several of my men played out. I picked 5 of the weakest and left them at a rendezvous point in case of trouble. Our native guide took the remaining 7 of us to our objective. At the time, our weapons consisted of 2 Browning automatic rifles, 1 Thompson, 1 carbine, 3 M1 rifles, and 33 grenades. I was glad I ordered 3 grenades carried per man, but there was much dissension about it. We rested at our hidden perimeter point so as to reach the enemy when all would be in from their search for food and might be congregated in preparing for their evening meal. It was close to 4 p.m. when we commenced our stalking of them. They had lived here for months unmolested. They had no security. We could hear them chopping wood and hollering when 200-300 yards away. We approached their position on the backside, away from the main trail. I cautioned the men to be extremely quiet. A bar and M1 covered our crossing the deep, steep gully only 70 yards from the Japanese. When nearly at the bottom, I slipped on a wet clay bank and landed on my rear. I sat there for what seemed like hours, but was only seconds, with my carbine trained on the facing bank above, listening, but the enemy kept right on chopping and singing. I was not only scared, but embarrassed as well. We made it up the bank, which, oddly enough, sat about 10 feet higher than the Japanese shacks. It was quite a sensation to find myself in a field manual situation. When I saw those enemy soldiers going about their everyday business of getting ready for supper, I felt like I did when sighting down on my first deer. I appreciated all my hunting experience and participation in organized athletics. Those past situations helped me control that runaway feeling in my stomach. What to do? I lay and watched them for 5 minutes, thinking about what course of action I should take. No, I didn't conscientiously make an estimation of the situation and draw up a 5-paragraph order. After I had looked, I made up my mind and told the men what we would do. Luckily, the platoon had dry run a similar situation only a few days previous, so we were all of the same mind. I guess under proper training conditions, a man thinks in an orderly manner and unconsciously follows a plan of systemized thinking when under stress. We were all in position to see from the reverse slope of the bank. We couldn't be seen because of the dense vegetation, but neither did we have a good field of fire. I placed my men with the right flank M1 and bar up on the line first to cover our final approach and withdrawal in case things went wrong. The rest followed into position as soon as the 2 right men had moved into place. Because of obscuring vegetation, the first line I formed was not adequate. We had to move farther down the forward slope to where the bank dropped away. The men moved forward individually, crawling sometimes in plain view of the enemy. The actions of the men showed the results of good discipline and combat experience. They would do their firing only if positively detected or on my signal, which would mean the throwing of grenades. I had collected 8 of them, and all during this phase of the operation held one, pin-pulled in each hand. Our final line was ideal. We looked down onto their position with 100% visibility. I had taken 15 minutes to work up to this point, and we were more than ready to start the fun, but we lay in observation for a minute or so while the men picked out their targets. The village was situated in a clearing. The enemy was completely in the open, and the farthest was only 40 yards. I could see 3 Japanese sleeping in shack #1. The side toward me had a large window. A group of 6 was eating in front of shack #2. 2 more were chopping wood. Others would occasionally show themselves, moving from one hut to the other. In all, there must have been nearly 25, or the better part of a platoon. I had cautioned the men to lay their magazines in front of them where they could get at them easily. I pointed at 6 enemy eating and then the 3 sleeping. My barman nodded, then grinned. I was dumbfounded and in a trance as I sat there, realizing what we had stumbled onto and accomplished without being discovered. I threw 1 grenade and then the other, following these with 6 more. Everything happened at once. The confusion and noise were terrific. Above the sound of our firing could be heard the Japanese screaming. For better than a minute, the shooting was done by us. There were only 7 of us, but then an enemy machine gun opened fire. I don't know where the first burst hit, but the second hit the bank only a few feet below us. The gun was located only 30 yards away and was silenced immediately by grenades, bar, and M1S. At this time, one of my men was hit and began sobbing, but the sound stopped as he pulled himself back over the hill. It was our native guide, hit by a fragment of our own grenades. There is no fair play in soldiering. You shoot the enemy in the back without warning. You allow them no protection. What is cowardly in kid games is good tactics to a soldier. About this time, someone in the United States smartened up, copying the Japanese Nambu light machine gun. We received bipods and shoulder stocks for our light machine guns. In addition, we got new trigger bases for our 60mm mortars. This enabled us to drop a mortar shell in the tube, place the tube over a shoulder, then back the base firmly to a tree. Sighting with a small strap-on sight, the mortar could be fired by jerking on a lanyard. This gave us direct fire on known gun positions. It wasn't the best solution, but it was an improvement. We received orders that every man must learn to swim. In easy company, we had about 18 non-swimmers. An abandoned engineer's gravel pit was selected as a pool, with a 20-foot platform erected to simulate a ship's side. The best swimmers in easy were selected as instructors. They completed their lessons in just over a week. Every man in the group could jump off the platform and swim across the lengthy gravel pit. As one man said to me, "All it took was confidence. I was always afraid of water." I was dissatisfied with our hand grenades, and after the 3rd Fiji Battalion left Bougainville, my source of supply for Mills bombs more or less dried up. I was fortunate to get a few grenades from Angao. Obtaining open-topped steel barrels, we experimented with the grenades, first centering one in the steel barrel. It left few holes, not fragmenting small enough. The big chunks were killers, but there were too few of them. The Japanese fragmentation grenades were far superior, showing good patterns. It only takes one small piece of iron inside you to kill. I crushed a block of TNT, powdering it to fill a US grenade. Substituting a number 10 detonator for the standard one, we blew it. It was a marvel, far superior to both standard US and Japanese grenades, and probably as good as the Mills. It made us all wonder, did our ordnance people back in the States experiment, or did they just get kickbacks, plus whining and dining by the manufacturers? Our grenades were designed for World War I. Another sore spot was the lack of grease paint. Our surgeon, Nathan Somberg, handed out gentian dye that was used for staining microscope slides as much as he had available. It worked, but faded with our excessive perspiration. Carbon black would have worked, even charcoal. Mud and water were only a temporary fix. Many times at night, flares would have been useful, but the battalion never seemed to carry them. Coloured smoke grenades were also in short supply and hard to obtain. They could be used to call for emergency fire or to mark a position. It became obvious to the men of Easy Company that stealth and surprise were the answer to jungle combat. The means to strike at close quarters with ferocity, then escape before the enemy could react, became a hard and fast rule. We laughingly referred to it as, "He who fights and runs away lives to fight another day." Nearly every man of our supposed 187-man company knew the others by their first name. Friendships developed. Each man knew the abilities of the other men in his squad or platoon. Knowledge of weapons was important, with each squad seeking a balanced team. Each man knew his life might depend on the ability of his comrades. Men lacking in experience were taken in hand, especially in weapons training. They paired up, supporting one another and providing covering, interlocking fire. Easy soon became a team. Standards for patrol were set since patrols sometimes were long, lasting 7 to 10 days. 3 canteens were carried, 2 with drinking water and 1 with white gas for the cook stove. Usually every 6th man carried a small Coleman gas stove. Its supply of fuel was determined by the length of the patrol. A full belt of ammo was carried. Those with M1 rifles also had 1 clip of tracer, red-tipped, 1 of armor-piercing, black-tipped, and 1 of incendiary, blue-tipped, each located in the back pockets of the belt. Many carried gun oil, compasses, field glasses, and an entrenching shovel or pick mattock. In addition, a jungle aid kit with salt tablets, water purification tablets, and a Carlisle, large bandage, for severe wounds were attached to the cartridge belt. The men also carried a combat knife and mosquito head net. Because of the weight of this belt, olive-drab suspenders were worn for support. The chest rings in them also supported 2 hand grenades. In addition to 1 blanket and a poncho per man in the jungle pack, the men carried their entire rations for the patrol, together with a round for the 60 mm mortars. This was not always the case. The number of mortar rounds depended upon the situation. Was artillery fire or 81 mm mortar fire available? In most cases, the men carried at least 70 pounds. On trail blocks, we dug in, camouflaging our positions. Movement after dark was limited. No lights, no smoking, just quiet, patience, and the exchange of guard duty. In addition to regular patrol equipment, I usually carried a small block of TNT, along with a number 10 detonator and 6 inches of time fuse. For an instant foxhole, we would dig an 8-inch deep hole with a knife, insert the TNT block with detonator and fuse attached, light the fuse, and crawl back 15 feet or so with our heads down. We had about a 20-second wait. The explosion would usually dig a good-size hole in most earth. The material deflected up, so we were safe. Do not try this in gravel or rocky ground. I demonstrated this technique several times, and many men carried that small block. It was also a mighty fine fishing tool. To a combat soldier, knowledge of explosives is a must. Booby trap know-how is a lifesaver, but so is safety training with explosives. In June 1944, a U.S. immigration officer showed up. He was dressed nattily in a white shirt with a black tie and trousers. He was brief and to the point. "Captain, I want you to call out all the Hispanics in your company for a formation." As it happened, we had about 12, all excellent soldiers who took their soldiering seriously. I knew many had joined the army for the pay. Sergeant Fedye gathered them out front. Many were as nervous as cats, expecting to be shipped back to the States and deported. The immigration officer smiled at them. "Since you are all soldiers in the United States Army, you are also all citizens of the United States." He went down the line to take the names of the grinning and happy Hispanics, their apprehension gone. He had given them their fondest wish, full citizenship in the United States. Lieutenant Sherrar came back one evening with news we could scarcely believe. He asked, "Any of you want to bed an army nurse? It will cost you $200 a crack, and I'm not punning." I questioned, "What army nurses? There aren't any on the island." He laughed. "But there are. They come in now with nearly every ambulance flight from the Hebrides." This was news, but of course we had little to do with the airfield. I asked, "Do those nurses stay overnight?" "Darned if I know. I just heard that 1 or 2 of them are putting out for cash." It was nearly a month later when Sherrar managed to get a copy of the Stars and Stripes Army newsletter. It was the first issue I'd ever seen. He'd picked this up at Americal Division headquarters. Now it was official. 2 Army nurses stationed on New Hebrides were charged. One had sent home nearly $50,000 in money orders, the other about half that amount. Talk about business acumen. Our many contacts with the enemy on patrols paid off in experience. We were improving our killing tactics without serious loss to ourselves. In late summer of 1944, Easy Company was ordered out to X Block, about 30 miles west of the Torquay River. We were to patrol vigorously for the enemy. I was fortunate to get the aid of Warrant Officer Bruce Watterson from Angao, with 4 of his New Guinea police boys to assist. By this time, engineers had built a road across the Torquay, terminating at the former position of a Japanese 150 mm gun about 5 miles to the west. Bruce was a tall, thin, ruddy-faced Australian who had been a plantation manager in the Lae-Salamau area of New Guinea. He explained that the natives there raided one another's villages periodically for women and other gains. They were so-called headhunters. The Australian government attempted to stop these depredations by forming groups of local military police. Bruce's men spoke only pidgin English with expressions such as 2 fella 10, 3 men across river. This translated to a total of 23 enemy, doubling the 10 by 2 and adding the 3. I never became proficient at speaking with his men, but I knew they understood what I wanted them to do. They were indoctrinated to hate the enemy and were sometimes a bit too bloodthirsty for my taste. Moving on foot from our truck drop, we travelled 4 or 5 miles west before we came to a steep, smooth rock coated with a slippery mould. At its base lay General Kanda's horse. It was no longer white in colour, but had turned a light brown, almost a sorrel. Every rib could be seen. The poor animal must have starved to death. Pressing farther on, we approached a perfect spot for an ambush. This setup had been bypassed by our most recent patrols, but had been used to good effect by the Japanese on Company 1, 3rd Battalion, not long ago. Our men had been killed, including the battalion surgeon. We had gotten off to a late start that day, so we bivouacked a few miles short of X Block. About 11 p.m. that night, I heard a man begin screaming. It was Sergeant Jacobson's younger brother. He had been bitten in the shoulder by a centipede. These 6 to 10 inch long, many-legged critters can move as fast as a rat and inject a poison through 2 protruding horns that is instantly terribly painful. To quiet him until morning, morphine had to be administered. When daylight arrived, he was sent back to the perimeter, escorted by 2 men. The company holding X block left immediately upon our arrival. I was surprised to find an EE8 telephone line had been run to the high ridge. It was operable. I had seen the line along the trail, but had figured it unusable since it lay in water and mud. Not knowing of this phone line in advance, I had placed 2 300 radios and spare batteries with 3-man crews on mountain tops we had bypassed to relay messages back and forth. They were to operate on even hours for contact. Our 300 radios had, so to speak, line-of-sight capability. In thick jungle, they were only good for 1 to 3 miles, but from one mountain top to another, with no foliage or cliffs between, they would transmit and receive 10 miles or more. Bruce was an able scrounger and had the Angau facilities at his beck and call. He phoned back to a friend, arranging for extra rations, an axe and other materials, all to be brought up by native carriers organised by the Angau group. The carrying party of over 50 natives arrived 2 days later. One of the natives approached Bruce with a tin container. Bruce removed the lid and grinned, then held out the can to me. Inside were 6 eggs. "We'll eat a high-on-the-hog breakfast tomorrow morning. We've a can of bacon, also that pancake flour you chaps carry." He put several natives to work making a nipper hut for us. 2 days later, we had a well-built 10 by 15-foot shelter with windows to the south, completely rainproof, all made from sago palm leaves and bamboo framing. I noticed 2 of his police boys were missing. He had sent them out to scout for Japanese farther to the west. He was jocular about it. "They'll be back in a day or 2. If there are Japanese nearby, we'll know just how to hit them." We discussed air supply drops using our artillery J3 Piper Cubs, also called L4S. When I called back on the phone to the artillery headquarters, the pilot wanted to know how to find us. He said, "It's all mountains and jungle. I'll never spot you." Bruce spoke up. "Tell him we'll cut a clearing on the ridge." He put a native crew cutting huge trees to clear an open spot. We got the first drop on the 4th afternoon, but it was badly damaged when it hit the ground. The padding was not adequate. A later drop was more successful. Bruce's scouts returned the 5th morning. I listened as he spoke with them, noting the sudden smile on his face. "Charlie, the Japanese have a trail block about 6 or 7 miles to our west. Evidently they feel secure, as some of the enemy went higher up the mountain range to cut palm centers for eating. My men could hear the machete strokes. They say we can intersect the trail they're taking, then break into their camp from the side door." He looked up at the sky. It was beginning to rain. It had been a dour, disheartening day. "It will be a tough climb in this weather. What do you think? Leave now or in the morning?" He looked at me questioningly. "Let's go now, but we'll have to wait until near dark to tap that upper trail. We sure don't want to meet any Japanese returning to their camp." Gathering the officers, I told them the plan. Within a half hour, we headed out to the west. The trail was typical jungle, mud, roots to trip over, and constant rain. Several miles out, the scouts stopped. A confab was held with Bruce. He turned to me. "It's a hellish climb up to that upper Japanese trail. It's nearly straight up, slippery as hell." I knew the men were soaked and would soon get cold at this altitude. "Let's get at it. At least we'll keep warm until we bed down tonight. We'll sleep just above the enemy when we reach the trail." Climbing the almost vertical rock wall in constant rain was difficult. Men occasionally slid back as much as 20 feet, but there was no complaining, only silence, with sharp whispered quips exchanged back and forth. We reached the trail between the Japanese and their meagre food supply just before complete darkness. From the fresh tracks being washed from the muddy path, we knew the Japanese had already returned downhill to their camp. Bruce and I discussed grabbing a prisoner as they came up the trail in the morning, but decided against it. He said, "My boys won't take prisoners. They only want to kill Japanese." I agreed with him, knowing the enemy executed every American they captured. Cautiously, I led the way downhill, wanting to be fairly close to the trail block, no farther than 150 yards if possible. I doubted they would be active since the heavy drizzle persisted. From past experience, our men wearing glasses had waterproofed the fronts of their caps with candle wax. Sleeping conditions that night were deplorable, but exhaustion helped. Also, we had 2 hours on guard and 2 hours off. By this time, easy soldiers were experienced and tough fighters. There was strict discipline, not a sound was heard, and everyone was tense with expectation. I was mighty proud of the men. They were aggressive, a team. Before leading out the next morning, I had a 60mm mortar crew go back up the trail with instructions to fire a few rounds just below the enemy camp as soon as we opened fire. This would put additional fear in the Japanese, I hoped. Bruce suggested I send one of his police boys along with a squad down the hill to our west to seal the outlet trail there. Unfortunately, when the shooting started, the young policeman, not wanting to miss the firefight, forgot his mission and led the group into the scrap. The escape trail was not blocked. Bruce and I led off. We hadn't gone 100 yards when, around a bend in the trail, we saw a Japanese soldier standing by a tent. He had his back to us while he spoke with his buddies inside. We could hear them talking. He wasn't 30 feet from us, hunched over against the steady downpour of rain. I believe we could have walked up and touched his shoulder. Our steps on the soggy trail were so quiet. I motioned a barman up alongside us just before Bruce and I each tossed a Mills bomb into the tent opening. We dropped flat until they went off. Then the barman poured 20 rounds into it. A mass charge was made down the hill by the entire company. So many grenades were thrown that I worried about our own men being wounded. 2 or 3 Japanese did escape to the west, at least one of whom was wounded. I stopped alongside an enemy soldier I thought dead, going through his pockets with my knife. He suddenly rolled over to face me, a grenade in his hand, his arm extended. Startled, I reacted and killed him. It was unnecessary, for he had nothing solid upon which to pop the primer on his grenade. The ground was all soft mud. Whether he had fallen and knocked himself out, was sleeping, or even playing possum is conjecture. He had not been wounded. We knew our reconnaissance platoon from 2nd Battalion, under Lieutenant Bouy, could possibly be in the area ahead of us. They had taken a side trail. Lamentably, the Japanese had cut off the main trail just 150 yards short of Bouy's patrol, crossing the river to the west. We found Bouy's reconnaissance unit well concealed but disappointed, ready to ambush the enemy as they retreated from us. We crossed the river to further check the Japanese and found the trail split just on the west side of the stream, the northeast trail leading to the coast at Kieta, about 15 miles, and the southwest trail, our escaping Japanese, leading to the ocean on the opposite side of the island. On the way back to X Block early in the afternoon, we stopped to search the bodies we had left. I found a clean sock filled with garlic nuts, all shelled. They looked like almonds and were delicious, growing on the trees here and there in the mountainous region. They were difficult to shell, but the work had already been done for me. I shared. On the way, I spotted a lone mountain apple. It was the size of a peach. Bruce clued me in on what was edible in the jungle. Sago palm was not only excellent for building nipa huts, it was porous in nature, honeycombed with a gummy material that looked like yellow sugar. If you boiled pieces of the wood, the sugary substance dissolved, and after boiling off the water, you had a material much like candy. And of course, Bruce recommended the grubs, saying they were nutritious, a case of mind over matter. Arriving back at X Block, the men were bedraggled and worn. I was forced to lay down the law about swimming in the river below the block. Our men were always to swim upstream of the natives, who were constantly bathing in the river. The reason? The natives thought nothing of defecating in the water, thus transmitting their diseases downstream. Many of the natives were infected with amoebic dysentery, to which they had a certain tolerance. Our men would eventually die from it unless treated. About 10 days later, approximately 5 easy men came down with the parasite. Everyone in the company was forced to crap in a paper cup for microscopic examination of their feces. 1 or 2 of the men admitted they had broken the rule, for which they suffered the consequences, massive doses of chemicals injected deep into their buttocks with hypo needles nearly 3 inches in length. On the 7th day on X Block, Bruce sent out one of his policemen, Constable Saga, with another man to see how far the Japanese had moved. On the morning we were to be relieved, they returned, saying 25 Japanese lived in a village just 15 miles or so southwest of us. I called regimental headquarters, asking for permission to stay out with 18 or so volunteers. The OK came, but I was to send the remainder of the company back to the perimeter. Bruce and I left the next morning at daylight, headed for the Japanese camp. My supply sergeant, John Wells, was one of the volunteers. He had never been on a patrol while in Bougainville. I took along 2 mortarmen with a trigger mortar and 18 rounds of ammunition. It was still daylight when we reached the Japanese camp, located on the west side of a fast, noisy mountain stream. Bruce's men had miscalculated. There were at least 45 enemy in this village, not 25. I said to Bruce, "Ask Saga if they have any guards posted. If so, where are they?" As Bruce and Saga conferred, Saga began to laugh. He dropped onto the ground and raised one leg to cross over the other in a carefree manner. Then he imitated a Japanese smoking a cigarette, casually removing it from his lips and moving his hand as if to waft away the smoke. He finally got up. We were all laughing. Evidently they felt so secure their guards were not alert. Units supposedly far from danger and not bothered become careless. Discipline becomes lax. Never lower your guard. Trouble comes when you least expect it. Finally, Bruce, Constable Saga, and I cautiously approached the river, each holding up a giant fern in front of our faces, with 2 leaves plucked to allow for viewing. There, on a protruding rock in the center of the stream, was a Japanese soldier sunning himself. He was stark naked, about 35 feet from us. Occasionally he eyed our side of the river suspiciously. I photographed him with the Signal Corps camera I carried, also the many nipa huts 100 to 150 feet away, just across the river. We backed off after I located a position for the 60 mm mortar on our side of the river. At 7 a.m. the next day, the mortar crew was to open direct fire on the huts, firing as many of the 18 rounds as possible. I left 2 men with grease guns, submachine gun .45 caliber MA1, to cover them. They were not to move into position until our jump-off time in the morning. At 6:30 a.m., under a dark overcast, we crossed the river below the Japanese, easing up the trail to the edge of the village. I wished for our entire company after finding more Japanese than we had anticipated. I knew a tight run through their camp would wipe them all out since they were all sleeping. After the men spread out, the first mortar shell whizzed through the trees above us. The second was also high. They failed to explode. Yelling Japanese were rousted from their beds. The remaining mortar shells were on target, destroying one nipa hut after another. Our men were all shooting. Japanese ran everywhere, attempting to escape. 6 ran past me so fast I could see nothing but their bobbing heads. They ran smack into Wells, who was covering the escape trail with his bar. As I knelt in firing position, a Japanese I hadn't seen ran straight at me, jumping over me as he headed west. One of Bruce's men shot him as he passed. When all the excitement was over, I checked him. He couldn't have been more than 12 or 13 years of age. Bruce and I were about 20 feet apart when a smoking Japanese grenade sailed through the air, landing exactly between us. I covered my head and neck with my arms as best I could, as did Bruce. It went off, neither of us getting a scratch. I knew the exact spot from where the grenade was thrown. Releasing a Mills bomb handle, I held it to the count of 3 before tossing it that 25 feet. Then I followed with the second. One of the police boys ran to the spot, then held up 4 fingers. He turned to me, grinning. Per our count so far, we had 14 enemy down and no one wounded. It was time to pull out. Carrying a wounded man nearly 30 miles in mountainous jungle was something I didn't want to worry about. Taking another escape route up a finger ridge just outside the village, we ran straight into a heavy machine gun. The enemy was just in the process of turning it around to fire downhill. It seemed they didn't want to be caught again by Americans descending into their camp from above, hence the safeguard. Below the camp, we took to the water, fast. I was the last man to cross, but then saw a man drifting by underwater. He had lost his footing in the fast water, and his bar was dragging him down by the neck. The water was so swift and chest-deep that I was lucky to snag the sling of his gun as he went by. Poor Wells was drowning, the sling tight around his neck. With men holding to one another, we got him out, but he was almost totally done in. Finally coming to, he coughed up copious amounts of water after we put him on the sloping bank, head down, facing downhill. We got away clean. I recommended Bruce Watterson for a Silver Star and Constable Saga for a Bronze Star. Unfortunately, Division Command saw it in a different light, giving each a Bronze Star. Lieutenant Milt Shedd, with his reconnaissance platoon, spotted many Japanese located in an unidentified village downstream. Visual contact was made while reinforcements in the form of Company H were sent for. Milt said, "While I watched the Japanese swimming, I wrote a letter to my wife." This is Lieutenant Shedd's version of his attack. "I called for reinforcements as my group was too small to take on such a large group of Japanese. We attacked at daylight. Each man knew exactly what he was to do. Everything ran smoothly. We caught them by surprise and moved in on them before they could get to their weapons. We captured and destroyed machine guns, mortars, rifles, carbines, pistols, quantities of food, ammunition, and clothing. The radios were the most valuable items. We ran across this bunch just in time. They were packed up and ready to move. I found their order from their regimental CO. I saw it translated. It was an order to die. It directed that every man in the entire group must die in order to abolish the disgrace incurred when this group had 14 men killed and then retreated, an unforgivable sin in the Japanese army, when many of the men were too sick to fight. The former CO had written a message stating that he did not want the men to disgrace themselves further, so he committed kamikaze in order to bolster their morale, his own words. The regimental CO directed that every man would assault even if naked. I held these documents in my hands. I took them from a dead officer's body. Later, Milt Shedd commented on his move up to regimental headquarters after being named reconnaissance officer. "Tonight we had steaks and French fries, a good meal. I also had steaks for lunch. We have had more fresh meat lately than is enjoyable. I like my new job very much. The work is better than what I did as a platoon leader. However, I liked the officers of Company E and miss them. The officers that I am around now are not here because they are good men, good soldiers or efficient workers, but rather because they are smoothies and backslappers. I subordinate myself to them and inflate their egos, so I get along fine. But I don't respect all the people I come in contact with. Being a man quick to notice discrepancies, I have much unpleasant food for thought." Returning to X Block, we spent the night. In the early morning, I told the patrol to take their time getting back to the perimeter, but Bruce and I set a grueling pace, arriving at our rear area by 3 p.m. That evening, First Sergeant Joel Fedge informed me that we had been issued 10 cans of beer per man. He wanted to know how many he should release to the men after retreat. Knowing what they had been through, without having a man wounded, I said, "Give it all to them. They deserve it." I hadn't given a thought to those men who didn't drink. They either sold their beer or gave it away. As a result, some of the company got mighty rowdy. Non-coms did their best to keep down the noise, but it was like trying to stop a runaway train. I was called on the carpet and given hell by the battalion commander. He said I should have known better. I shrugged it off, knowing the tension the men had been under. They were entitled to let off steam. I was anxious to return the Signal Corps camera and film they had given me. I had been promised a copy of each photo for taking the camera along. When Pete Scherer returned the camera to the Signal Corps, their captain thanked him, but said, "I'm sorry, I can't give you copies. It's prohibited." I had been double-crossed. That captain had had no intention of giving me copies of the combat photos. Much later, when we were finally to leave the island, Scherer approached me. "Do you want to get even with that SOB?" "You're darned right! But how are we going to swing it?" "I'll tell him you're going on another patrol, willing to take more pictures of Japanese." It worked. We used the camera and 3 rolls of film to take pictures of the company. We also took the camera to the Philippines, where it mysteriously disappeared. One of our own men, Corporal Tom Attardo, was a professional photographer in civilian life. He managed to take an exceptional picture of Mount Bagana, the active volcano to our north. He sold copies and had them delivered in the States for $5 each. His letters were voluminous, consisting of names and addresses of those to whom he had sold a picture. On our 5th war bond drive, he won a $100 war bond for purchasing the most war bonds. Such ingenuity received an ample reward. Somehow, somewhere, we had picked up a big twin Johnson outboard motor. Paul Clemens also liberated a brand new 4-cylinder Evinrude from the Navy. We soon located an engineer assault boat with a capacity of 10 men. This opened the way to deep-sea fishing. On Guadalcanal, mullet schooled close to shore, easy to get with explosives. On Bougainville, the giant rolling surf precluded that. Paul got the idea of tying together 10 camouflage nets, making a 100-foot-long seine with 105 mm nose plugs for weight on the bottom edge, and flotation bladders attached to the upper edge. With a 100-foot rope on each end, our boat hauled it straight out into the ocean, turning back in a U-shaped sweep. Coming close to shore, they tossed the rope to a crew there. When the net was retrieved, it held many kingfish. Sometimes it was a slow process due to rough surf, but it often fed the entire company. The tide was high at times with a strong undertow. I saw a man swept out to sea, finally disappearing. Even with the risk, men body surfed, some using mattress covers as surfboards. Pete Sherrar, through his CB connections, got several of us a Sunday fishing trip on a Higgins boat. Not many fish were caught, but countless bottles of beer were consumed. The entire division participated in the 5th War Bond Drive. Easy raised $36,000, which I was antsy to put in the finance officer's coffers. The reason? During the War Bond Drive, an officer from the 1st Battalion had collected cash and had left it in his tent. It was stolen and never recovered. He was forced to repay that money. A good friend of mine, Colonel Mathewson, an Australian with the 132nd Infantry, invited me to accompany him to watch a tank attack in the jungle near the ocean. I was to meet him at 8 a.m. the following morning. Previously, I had called the finance officer to get an appointment. His return call came early that same morning. "Bring in your war bond money." At the finance office, they counted, and recounted the huge pile of $1, $5, $10, and $20 bills, each time getting a different total. I was anxious to get away, but couldn't. At 11 a.m., a message rippled through division headquarters. Colonel Mathewson, the executive officer of the 132nd Infantry, and 2 or 3 others had been killed by a Nambu machine gun the tanks had bypassed. I had lucked out again. While waiting impatiently at division headquarters, I saw a bulletin board near the G1 tent. It read, "Colonel No Good and General Nuisance are each awarded the Silver Star Medal for outstanding bravery, risking their lives along the front lines." After the fighting on Hill 260 and the attack on the 37th Division many months earlier, there wasn't a Japanese near any of our front lines. You never saw these general orders posted at our regimental or battalion headquarters, only on the division bulletin board outside the G1 tent. The commanding general of a division was empowered to award the Silver Star for bravery, but also cheapen this coveted medal by passing it out freely to the high brass. I saw it happen again and again. GIs worked under deplorable conditions, risking life and limb, while graduates of the great school along the Hudson padded their fruitcake chests. I was also late for the battalion meeting and was panned by the colonel. He asked me the reason. I said, "I delivered $36,000 to the finance office and they mulled over it for 3 hours. He persisted, "Why did it take them so long?" What I had seen on the bulletin board still rankled me. I replied, "The officer who counted the money must have been a West Pointer." So I buried myself a little deeper. One evening, just at dusk, I observed something huge crawling toward a bulldozed pile of trees. Engineers had cleared much of the area between our company and the AA unit for a ball diamond. It was into this extensive pile of trees the creature tunneled. It was not a crocodile or alligator, but it was just as large. Its tail was 6 to 8 feet long, dark-coloured, it looked to have a smooth skin, not like the bumpy back of a croc or gator. I went over to where it had crawled under the trees and saw large claw prints. It had to be a giant monitor lizard, perhaps what they called a Komodo dragon. However, I wasn't aware that any Komodos existed on Bougainville. Weren't they in the Indonesia area? Another prevalent animal was the kinkajou, a species of the raccoon family, normally native to South America. About the size of a cat, it had fairly short, firm hair and was a great climber, eating fruit and blossoms. During periods of tension at night, its rustling high in the overhanging trees caused apprehension among the men. As we were preparing for the invasion of the Philippines, the Australian Home Guard was brought to Bougainville to relieve us. It seems that country had two armies, the volunteers who fought overseas, such as at Anzio, and the volunteers who were not to be shipped out of the country. These Home Guard troops were not happy about being shipped to Bougainville. In fact, they were mighty grim about it. We easy officers were invited to visit an Australian unit after a brief acquaintance. By midnight we were all home again, but with 3 Aussies who promptly decided to sleep on our floor. When I woke up on Saturday morning to take reveille formation, the Aussies were still sleeping. After our formation, while awaiting breakfast, I heard a shot fired just past the mess tent. Crossing the road, I met a man midway along the company street. He was holding his bleeding arm. I said, "Get to the battalion surgeon." Backtracking, I found that a medic attached to our company had fired the shot. After the inspection, he had placed a loaded clip in his carbine and, without thinking, slid the bolt home. It had been open for inspection. Holding his carbine at hip level, he had stupidly pulled the trigger. At the time, it seemed an accident without serious consequences. Minutes later, I heard yelling farther up the company street on the opposite side. Upon checking, I found that an easy man who had just returned from the hospital, he had prior wounds, was dead. The bullet had passed to the opposite side of the company street from where it was fired, passed through a man's arm, then struck a glancing blow on a fragile orange crate used to hold clothing. A shallow groove was cut in the thin board, the bullet striking it at a slight angle. It ricocheted from this springy board, crossed back to the other side of the street, and entered the second man's temple. I sent the medic to battalion, where he was moved farther on. I constantly stressed gun safety, but sometimes you are powerless to control the whims of men. In our entire year on Bougainville, we lost only 2 men, but we killed well over 85 enemy while on patrol. We shouldn't have lost either of those 2 men. Stupid things did happen. When a man was wounded, another stepped into his place. We recovered every man we lost, making sure they were turned over to Graves registration. Our wounded received the best care possible, even under pressing circumstances. Lieutenant Charles Ross organised a tracking school that I unfortunately missed. I found it received rave reviews. He had obtained his instructors from the 3rd Fiji Battalion. At one point, I was told, a man was asked to touch leaves on a vine. A Fijian was then asked to detect which one the man had touched. He picked the right vine by smelling each. It brought to mind the Ango police boys showing me the faint blood trail high on the leaves while patrolling on the east-west trail, and pointing out the deep imprints of feet, indicating 2 Japanese carrying one of their own. Basics of tracking should be mandatory if knowledgeable men can be found for teachers. The talent among the men in Easy was amazing. We had miners, carpenters who could build anything of wood, plumbers, cowboys, mechanics, electricians, and men of nearly every trade, even a first-class barber. One man, Private Blackwell, took over the winches on a ship when the ship's crew refused overtime hours. He made the regular merchant marine crane operator look like an amateur. It is said that it is lonesome at the top. Well, I wasn't very far up, and I admit it was lonesome at times. Fortunately, my wife sent me reading material, books that I read many times. There are other sayings. Familiarity breeds contempt, monkey see, monkey do, etc. To a certain extent, these sayings are true. Respect must be earned. It doesn't come with army rank. Yet 75% of the high-ranking officers I met didn't realize their failings. They thought they had been anointed by the great school they had attended. I found the most capable and humane officers were of civilian status or had come up through the ranks. Yet someone up at regimental must have liked me. Word came down that I was to get a Silver Star cluster for a patrol on the Tangarunga River, wherever that was. Apparently they had maps of Bougainville at division headquarters, but they weren't distributed to those who should have had them. Late in December of 1944, a short, stocky, businesslike captain appeared at Easy Company. Under his arm he carried a bulging briefcase. He held out his hand to me as he introduced himself. "I'm Mark Fares. I'm here to teach you how to combat load a ship that will be joining the Southern Philippines Task Force. You probably know that Kruger's 6th Army landed on the east coast of Leyte on October 20th. The Americal Division will be needed on the cleanup operation there." I was flabbergasted. "I don't know anything about loading a ship. How did this come about? Who sicked you onto me? To whom am I indebted for this great honour?" He began to laugh. It was plain he was a jovial man you couldn't dislike. "Your battalion boss picked you. I don't know the circumstances, but you're it. It really isn't too difficult. Your battalion will be aboard a Liberty ship named the Lew Wallace. You've probably heard that name before. I know he was a Union general during the Civil War and wrote Ben-Hur after his retirement. He was also appointed governor of New Mexico, where all that feuding occurred. That's the man. The ship named after him has 5 cargo holds, and this booklet," he produced a large folder of sheets, "is called A Ship's Characteristic Pamphlet." He went on to explain what each hold would carry, the many decks in each hold, and the size of each hold and deck. He said, "It's easy. You have so many vehicles in your battalion. Make paper cutouts, an 1/8 inch to the foot for every vehicle, then place them over these same scale drawings of each hold and deck. You'll know just where to place each, what fits where. But be sure to spot equipment in the order you want it unloaded. Dunnage can be stacked between or on the vehicles. Of course, your combat loads of ammo will be on the vehicles, plus your heavier weapons." Sure enough, he set me up to the point that when the convoy of ships arrived, we loaded the ship quickly, almost painlessly. The only catch was the reconnaissance outfit. Someone at division had forgotten about their tanks. As we had one of the few winches capable of lifting them, a 45-ton winch over our No. 2 hatch, the tanks were deck-loaded on our ship. The skipper and the ship's officers weren't happy about this heavy deck load, but were forced to accept the decision from above. I hoped the trip would go well, but was a bit sceptical. We had army troops, a merchant marine crew, a navy gun crew, and a pickup lot of ship's officers. The latter looked mighty sloppy, and later proved so. We were scheduled to enter Hollandia Harbour in New Guinea a few days later. At 4 a.m., 7 a.m. found us blithely steaming up the coast, far past our turn-in to Hollandia. I was told the navigation officer had overslept. As most men were sleeping topside, on deck, I awoke to hear shouting along the port side. Suddenly, a tremendous explosion occurred just in front of the bow of the ship. We were deluged with seawater from the blast. Several men swore they saw the torpedo as it came from a rear angle on the port side of the ship. Whether it actually struck the ship, glanced off and discharged, or had some magnetic type of detonator is a moot point, but it did explode within a few yards of the bow. Whoever was at the helm of the ship turned sharply to starboard in a half-circle before straightening out for our return to Hollandia. We entered a narrow inlet about 10:15 a.m. to find the huge harbour filled with hundreds of ships. As we dropped anchor between a hospital ship and a troop transport carrying our 3rd Battalion, those men of the 3rd shouted across to us, "You should have been here last night." A sub tossed torpedoes into the harbour, hitting an ammunition ship. It blew up. Lots of fireworks. I wondered at the time how all of these ships would ever get turned around in the harbour, as apparently there were about 500 involved in this southern fleet. Somehow, 2 days later, it was accomplished. For a few days, the huge convoy had fair weather, then we entered the edge of a hurricane with exceptionally heavy seas. The Lew Wallace rolled badly, perhaps abetted by the deck load. Ship officers said it nearly overreached its safe maximum inclination. At its utmost slant, hesitating there for as long as 30 seconds, someone said, "She's going over next time." The sea was so heavy we were all below decks sitting in hatchways. We reached Leyte, the Philippines, near Dulag, just before dark on January 21st, 1945. As the ship eased toward shore, it suddenly ground to a halt, stuck tight in a bed of sand. Fortunately, near midnight, a bit more tide enabled the ship to reverse engines, back off, and anchor in deeper water until daybreak. About 7 a.m., we began moving north to the Tacloban docks. As we began to pick up speed, I noted a large yellow marker buoy. This warning was only about 100 feet to the left front of our ship. I was standing on the number 2 hatch and suddenly saw very shallow water ahead. The bow of the ship began to rise amid horrible crunching sounds. The ship came to a halt, bow almost out of the water, with the stern sunk almost to the rails. That evening, Japanese aircraft attacked our naval escort about 8 miles east of us. The sky was instantly black with AA fire. A lone aircraft appeared out of the melee, headed straight for us. Our new battalion CO, my nemesis from Company G, who was standing next to me, said, "Chuck, they can't sink us, we're already sunk." The aircraft pulled up just in time to clear our masts, going inland. It was Japanese. For several evenings, ocean-going tugs, LSTs and other ships attempted to pull us off the reef. All failed. Finally, a Navy salvage crew came out from shore with a barge. They placed it at the bow, lowering the ship's anchor on the port side down to the barge. Towing it to the rear of the ship, the anchor was then lifted and dropped into deeper water. The same was done on the starboard side. By using the ship's anchor winches, the ship was pulled off the reef by its own power. I was told leaks in the bow plating were minimal. We were on this reef for a total of 12 days before our battalion was loaded into small craft for the trip to shore. We had almost run out of food, but the cooks made bread from old weevilly flour found in the ship's stores. We picked out the dark spots as we ate the slices. In retrospect, I believe the Japanese submarine used its last torpedo on us, since we were an easy, cold turkey shot. If they had more torpedoes, they surely would have sunk us. Risking losing the ship and the lives of several hundred men to drowning by the incompetence of the Lew Wallace officers deserved nothing less than severe punishment to those guilty. But we knew it would all be covered up as usual. Finally on shore, we bivouacked inland a short distance to await the unloading of our vehicles. As in prior instances, maps were at a premium. Those issued to us looked more like cartoons. Our destination was to be the town of Valencia. Travelling west through Dagami, up the Leyte Valley toward Carigara, we passed a small fighter strip with a few parked P-40 aircraft. There seemed to be little action at this field. Reaching Carigara, we found the road that ran along the beach badly washed out by wave action for nearly 10 miles. Engineers had built plank bridges here and there to cover gaps, but the road required constant repair due to wind and tides. Entering mountainous country, we witnessed the devastation caused by the Japanese. American tanks lay along the road, burned out or destroyed by direct fire from Japanese field guns. Each sharp turn concealed an enemy cannon, still in place, destroyed by the 1st Cavalry and 24th Infantry Divisions. We had been warned that a few Japanese sore losers often shot at the trucks from ambush, but we travelled without incident. Reaching Valencia at noon, each company organised its bivouac area. Previously made latrine forms were nailed together, and a low latrine tarp was erected for modesty. By 4 p.m. we were fully settled, but before I reported to battalion headquarters, I was approached by one of the men. "Captain, I can't use the latrine. You should see what's going on over there." I accompanied him to the latrine to find at least 25 Filipino women laughing and gesturing at the endowments of some of the men, who seemed not a bit bashful. In fact, a few were braggarts, showing off. It was apparent these women had associated with troops before, as most were evidently prostitutes. I was forced to place a temporary guard to put the run to them. To our west were plenty of enemy, some units disorganized, but many groups were headed up the Ormoc Valley to join General Suzuki in a last defensive position in the mountains near Abijao. The next few days were spent on short patrols. One of Easy's platoons captured a Japanese who turned out to be from China. He claimed to be Chinese, having been captured there, and forced into the Japanese army as a truck driver. It brought to mind a story I had heard. About a year earlier, John Gossett had asked a naval officer how you could tell the difference between a Japanese and a Filipino. The answer John got: "Line them up and slap their faces. The ones who slap you back are Filipinos." After getting our equipment back in shape, I was called to battalion headquarters and given a crude map of the road to Ormoc. I was instructed to load up my company the next morning and clear the road of Japanese. We loaded up in several 2.5-ton trucks, moving north of Valencia to intersect the West Road. We hadn't gone far, perhaps 5 to 6 miles, climbing a mountain ridge, when I heard machine gun fire ahead. Stopping on a slight grade, I walked to the top of the hill to find several guerrillas firing down at 2 clumps of brush located amid rice paddies. Directly. Across and parallel to our ridge was another a mile away, but between the two all was rice paddies and water. Below our ridge, to the right, lay a small village with a few huts. I noted the light machine gun they were firing was rusty. They were having problems with it. This was true of most weapons the guerrillas had. No one had ever taught them how to care for them. They had been smuggled in by submarine and given freely. Why bother to clean and oil them? "What are you men firing at?" I was curious. One man spoke up. "Some Japanese came into our village last night and took a young girl." I walked back to the edge of the road, beckoning to my jeep driver to bring up his vehicle. There was no point in asking the guerrillas what they were going to do. Their machine gun had finally stopped on a ruptured cartridge. They were on their last few rounds in the gun belt. By this time, Shorty Breeding, my driver, had the jeep on the edge of the hill overlooking the rice paddies. The vehicle had a .50 caliber machine gun mounted on a pedestal. I weighed the pros and cons, finally deciding to drop a 60 mortar shell in the larger clump of bush. I did value the life of the girl, but if she was flat on her back, she should be reasonably safe. "Shorty, go back and have the 4th platoon bring up a 60mm mortar with a few rounds, then load up that 50 caliber. Our mortarmen were good. The first round landed smack in the centre of the largest clump, tossing a spray of water in all directions. A second later, enemy soldiers exited the brush in a panic, running out into the water-covered rice paddies. Between the rifle fire of the guerrillas and the .50 caliber machine gun, all were shot. I called Valencia to report our brief stop and was told to return to base. No reason was given for this abrupt change in plan. The problem of the girl was left to the guerrillas. The next day, I was told to send out a platoon patrol to the west. Lieutenant Charles Ross took 2nd Platoon with plenty of rations. He reported back late that afternoon about 5 p.m., saying he had killed approximately 45 enemy without loss to his men. His further total after completion of his patrol was much, much more. He was recommended for a Silver Star. It was awarded. Because of his ratio that first day, I was further ordered to send out my 1st and 3rd platoons for the same patrol duties. On the 3rd day, I was told to take the remainder of my company, headquarters personnel, supply and kitchen help, to provide a 4th group for another patrol. I got 2 light machine guns from Company H for additional support. Initially, Charles Ross's platoon had run into 2 Japanese machine guns on their move toward Ormoc. His comments follow. These 2 machine guns were located on the side of a mountain. The platoon had no artillery or mortar support and no radio contact. A young Filipino, Victorio Marget, we called him Vicky, volunteered to fight with my platoon. He took over as lead scout. I was the number 2 man. Near the foot of the mountain, I stopped the patrol and looked in the window of a one-room shack, but saw nobody inside. I moved off a bit. Vicky entered the shack, then fired 2 shots, killing 2 Japanese officers. He came out carrying their samurai swords. Passing the swords to the rear, he continued to lead the way. The mountain was steep, covered with heavy vegetation. As we moved single file up a dry stream bed, we got into a firefight, the enemy firing from behind huge boulders in the stream bed. I removed a pistol from a Japanese officer we shot. I was concerned that the noise from the firefight would alert the enemy we were approaching. Our plan was to circle wide around the machine guns and attack from the rear. As the platoon came within 100 or so yards of the gun positions, Vicky was still lead scout. I was about 5 or 6 yards behind him. Just as Vicky reached the point where the trail made a 90-degree turn, a single shot rang out, and Vicky fell forward. Immediately an enemy soldier approached him. I fired 8 rounds into him as fast as I could pull the trigger on my M1. Vicky died almost instantly. Sergeant Jeffrey came to me to ask about moving out. I nodded. Jeffrey then led out as scout. As we set up a skirmish line and moved up the mountain, we found the enemy had retreated. Jeffrey didn't ask me if he could be point man, he just took over the job. He had courage. Minutes before my composite group left Valencia, I received a radio call from Mac, the battalion commander. He said, "Don't bring in any more prisoners. We have no place for them." I knew this was against the Geneva Convention. This was a surprise. I asked, "Will you put that in writing for me?" He was actually laughing on the radio. "Hell no! Just do it." We proceeded past Mount Magueng, which we had nicknamed Chalk Mountain. The side to the east had a huge white scar. Climbing around to the rear, we were about to bed down for the night when we heard a rifle shot about 100 yards ahead of us. At first, I thought we had been spotted. Then I heard a chicken squawking, followed by loud laughter. We were next to a group of Japanese, perhaps 20 to 25, who were gathered near a house raised on wood piling just across a small, dry wash from us. We sized up the situation at dawn. Just below us, I watched 2 Japanese enter another house in the bottom of the wash. Sergeant Jim Cecil was with me. I said, "I'll set up a base of fire for the house across the gully, but I'm going to get one of those 2 Japanese in the bottom. Are you game for the other?" He grinned. "I'll take one of them." When the shooting started, we ran down into the gully just as the 2 enemies split from the house. My Japanese took to the bush. I ran him down. Jim's was too fast, but while climbing up the far hill, someone got him. The enemy on the far side of the gully had defensive holes dug beneath the raised house, delaying us for a few minutes. I could see why Lieutenant Charles Ross was racking up that body count. We had nearly 25 enemy already. We pressed on, seeing Japanese everywhere, flushing many out at easy rifle range. Others were too far away, but we persisted, getting them. Travelling north-northwest, I knew we would eventually meet up with the rest of Easy. Passing through a deserted village, we ran into a hornet's nest. One of our men was struck a glancing blow on his forehead by a bullet. It made a half-cup-shaped indentation above his forehead. He was instantly unconscious. A medic moved in to care for him. I found a man had abandoned his forward post, refusing to go on. He said, "I'm not leaving my buddy. I'm going to care for him." My first sergeant was beside me when I stuck my rifle muzzle into his stomach. I told him I would count to 3, then I would blow him away if he didn't get back to his squad. At the 2 count, he left. Sergeant Fedye looked at me curiously. "Would you really have done it?" The man had caused trouble before. I knew him well. "I had no choice. If I let him get away with it, the company wouldn't be worth a damn." Fedye said no more.